All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our lesson that we're going to be talking about in our next kind of chapter here about equality and changes in the 1960s and 70s for other groups and things like that. And this is for May 22nd, 2018. So our objectives and standards: to understand the fight for equality by Latinos in the United States and recognize the fight for equality by Native Americans in the U.S. And please take a look at the standards too. And our desired result here: how did Latinos and Native Americans gain equal rights? We have a couple of vocab words here. United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, or the UFWOC. That's a group of farm workers who fought for union rights, higher wages, and other benefits. La Raza Unida, if I'm hopefully saying that correctly, translated into, so what it's translated into is the People United, and it was a group that looked to build an independent Latino political movement to gain power in government. And then our final vocab word here is the American Indian Movement, or AIM, a group of often militant Native Americans that believed reform for Native Americans was moving too slow. Excuse me. Okay, so the largest Latino group, Mexican Americans, mostly lived in the Southwest in California. Now, many were descendants of Mexicans who lived in the area that was given to the United States following the Mexican-American War. So remember, this is areas like Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Texas, things like that down there in the southwestern part of our country. Around 1910, around 1 million Mexicans came to the United States following the Mexican Revolution, I guess I should say in 1910. Others came as braceros. We talked about them already in class back in the 1950s. They were hired labor that came to work in like farms and agriculture, and during the war, mostly during World War II, and then they were, pretty much told to leave once they were done working, but many of them stayed anyway. And then in the 1960s, we see more Mexicans immigrate to the United States for better paying jobs. Some other Latino groups: Puerto Ricans began coming to the United States after the occupation of the island by the U.S. So remember that the United States gained Puerto Rico as a territory following the Spanish-American War. So many will come to the U.S. after that. In 1960, there were 900,000 Puerto Ricans living in the United States. There were also large populations of Cubans, and many Cubans especially lived in New York City, Miami, and New Jersey. And the reason for them coming to the U.S. was many had fled Cuba after 1959, when Fidel Castro took over the country and the government and established a communist regime. So many Cubans flee the country because of that. But despite their large numbers and their growing numbers in the country, many Latinos face discrimination, unemployment, and poverty. So workers on California fruit and vegetable farms faced difficult conditions. They worked for very little pay and benefits. The working conditions weren't the greatest. And there's a man who comes about. His name is Cesar Chavez, and he believed that the farm workers needed to unionize. So in 1962, Cesar Chavez, I'm sorry, I messed up his name here. Let me fix that real quick for you. Should be a Z here, I apologize. Cesar Chavez. If I can draw a Z here on my, there we go. Sorry about that. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta founded the National Farm Workers Association. Now, 4 years later, it became the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, or UFWOC, after they merged with a Filipino agriculture union that was founded by Huerta as well. Okay, Chavez and his fellow members demanded that California's large fruit and vegetable companies accept their union for bargaining. In 1965, the California grape growers refused to recognize the union. So Chavez launched a nationwide boycott of grapes by the company. So the company that was making the growing the grapes and things like that. And he was also a strong advocate of nonviolence, just like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So he uses a lot of nonviolent techniques to get his message across. For example, the union sent farm workers to supermarkets all over the country to convince Americans not to buy the grapes until these people were treated equally. And Chavez himself did not eat for 3 weeks, and he lost 35 pounds during his fasting. Again, if you just kind of different ways of protesting peacefully. So the actions finally worked, and in 1970, Huerta signed a contract between the UFWOC and the grape growers for higher wages and better benefits. The activities of the California farm workers helped spark more movements around the country for Latinos. In New York, Puerto Rican group members began demanding that schools offer Spanish-speaking classes and classes on their culture. In 1968, Congress enacted the Bilingual Education Act to provide funds for schools to develop bilingual and cultural programs for non-English speaking children. Also, the phrase Chicano or Chicana became to be used by younger Mexican Americans to display pride in their heritage. And instead of saying, instead of calling themselves Mexican Americans, they begin to call themselves Chicanos or Chicanos to recognize that they are also Mexican, not just American as well. In 1968, the Brown Berets, under the leadership of David Sanchez, organized a student walkout in East Los Angeles high schools to demand smaller class sizes, more Chicano teachers and administrators, and programs to reduce the Latino dropout rate. And Mexican Americans that were militant gained more Chicano programs and studies at colleges and universities. So again, just this growing movement for Hispanic Americans and Latinos. Latinos started to organize politically during the 1960s. The Mexican American Political Association, or MAPA, helped elect Latinos to government positions. And Jose Angel Gutierrez looked to create an independent Latino political movement. In 1970, La Raza Unida was established. That's the People United. And they were organizing to help elect Latinos to government positions as well, kind of off of their own political party. Instead of using Democrats and Republicans to get Latinos in, they were looking to create their own kind of political party in a sense. So there were some other attempts as well. Some Latinos took a more confrontational approach to equality. In 1963, Reyes Tuana, I'm trying my best with that, a one-time evangelical preacher, founded the Alianza Federal de Mercedes, or the Federal Alliance of Land Grants. And what this organization wanted to do was reclaim U.S. land taken from Mexican landholders, excuse me, in the 1800s. So the land that was taken away from Mexican Americans in the 1800s. So the group raided the Rio Arriba County Courthouse in Tierra Amarillo, New Mexico, and in an attempt to force authorities to recognize the struggle of New Mexican small farmers. And they were later arrested, but just goes to show you that there were some other kind of more violent protests and things like that. Okay, struggles for Native Americans. So Native American groups have struggled with the lack to control and govern their own lives. Many resisted being blended or assimilated into the mainstream society. Native Americans have typically been the poorest of Americans and with the highest unemployment rate. They also suffer from tuberculosis and alcoholism more than any other group. And the death rate for Native American births was extremely high in the 1960s and going into that, and their life expectancy was much shorter than other Americans. In 1954, we talked about this too, the Eisenhower administration enacted a termination policy to address the problems Native Americans were facing. So Native Americans were relocated from reservations to urban areas to help them find work, to help them, again, kind of be assimilated into society or become part of American society in the mainstream. The plan failed, and many remained unemployed or in poverty. In 1961, members of 61 Native American groups met in Chicago and drafted the Declaration of Indian Purpose. It called for an end to the termination policy and a better way for Native Americans to govern themselves and better economic opportunities on reservations. So in 1968, President Lyndon Johnson established the National Council on Indian Opportunity to help support the needs of Native Americans. And again, there's just a lot of slow reform going on, so many young Native Americans were frustrated with this, and this led to the growth of the American Indian Movement, or AIM. Originally founded to protest against police brutality, it soon spread to include protecting the rights of Native American populations of northern and western states. And some of their demands were Native American lands, burial grounds, fishing, and timber rights be restored to them. So Native American groups such as AIM and others began to confront the government. Sometimes they became violent. In 1972, AIM leader Russell Means organized the Trail of Broken Treaties. The march took place in Washington, D.C. to protest the government's violation of treaties throughout history. The protesters demanded 110 million acres of land be restored and the abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And marchers occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs building for a short period of time and destroyed records. In 1973, 200 Sioux Native Americans led by AIM seized the tiny village of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, and took hostages. It had been the location of a Sioux village in 1890 that was massacred by the U.S. cavalry. So the members were pretty much protesting against tribal leadership and federal policies. And after tense negotiations and a shootout that resulted in the deaths of 2 Native Americans as well as the wounding of another, the conflict ended, and the government promised to re-examine treaty rights for Native Americans to resolve this tension. So some victories for Native Americans. In 1972, Congress passed the Indian Education Act, which provided federal funds for Native American groups at all education levels and empowered parents to form advisory boards. 1975, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act, which gave Native Americans more control over their own affairs. And Native Americans also went to courts for rights to their land. In 1970, the Taos of New Mexico were able to regain their sacred Blue Lake and part of the surrounding forest land, and the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 gave more than 40 million acres to Native Americans and paid more than $962 million in cash. Okay, our closure. How did Latinos and Native Americans gain equal rights? Think about some of the Native American groups and some of the people and individuals who played a role in pushing for better treatment of Native Americans and equal rights, and also with Latinos as well, such as Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, some of their organizations and groups and some of the things that they did, and that will help you answer your question. Have a great rest of your day or night. Talk to you soon.